Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the first chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is one of the three books which are written by Solomon. The order in which they are arranged in the narrative sequence, or not the order in which they were written in the Bible. It goes Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon was written in his younger years. Proverbs was his middle years, and Ecclesiastes is his most mature musings, and I feel his masterpiece. Now, Solomon was a king and a sage. He was the personification and embodiment and actualization of the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king in whom wisdom was united with power. Now, that word philosopher is uniquely Greek, but in the East, lovers of wisdom were known as sages, and Solomon certainly has many sagacious sayings which are recorded in these three books. The first one, Song of Solomon, many scholars erroneously classify it as wisdom literature. Now, wisdom is found and imparted throughout the entire Bible, but it has its specific concentration in wisdom literature books, which are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, and some of the wisdom psalms. But there is plenty of wisdom in the law and in the prophets and in the New Testament, of course. But the emphasis of Song of Solomon is a love ballad. It's poetry, and it's not a whole lot of wisdom there, to be quite frank. But I think a lot of these scholars think that having a married wife to whom you can confide in sappy, sentimental sayings is commensurate with a wise life, and there is some no argument against that, but it really doesn't belong quite in wisdom literature. Proverbs most certainly does. It is covenantal in reflection, so of the three Old Testament genres, law, prophecy, and writings or wisdom, the covenantal one very much informs. The covenant of Moses is very much reflected in Proverbs, the system of rewards and punishments. You do good and good things happen to you. Job and Ecclesiastes challenge this notion. They notice there's exceptions to the rules, that because what is written in Proverbs are promises, are principles, not promises. So that there is no form of perfect justice. Good things do not always happen to that good people, and you do good, and sometimes evil and falls you, and the wicked flourish. And so these are radical. The latter two, Ecclesiastes and Job, are radical challenges to the conventional orthodoxy of wisdom. But of these now, Solomon approaches it as a observer rather than a victim from the anomalies of life, as does Job. Solomon is on top of the world. He is a king, and he has the reason. Now, he is a king with extraordinary insight into the minds of his subjects. He knows that his dilemmas are not unique to him. Every human being asks the questions that the book of Ecclesiastes answers. The latter two books of wisdom literature are ask-oriented. Job asks the question of why do good things happen to good people. It's a theodicy which explores and explains the relationship of suffering in the righteous. The question that Ecclesiastes asks is, what is the meaning of life? There are several questions within these questions, and these questions are not unique to Solomon, although they do not quite receive as articulate form as they do in him. But these are questions that every person asks, and they are perplexing and disquieting and discomforting. So in a sense, wisdom literature, especially the books of Job and Ecclesiastes, are the most painful genre to endure, in that it is ask-oriented. It lacks the absolutes and concrete certainties of the law and prophecy, and the questions that are left unanswered remain. So part of wisdom is asking the questions that are too challenging to answer, and that is very much what we read of throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, the first verse reads, "The word of Quoleth, son of David, king in Jerusalem." These are not the words of Solomon, who is Quoleth and son of David, but the author of Ecclesiastes. Solomon is the creative genius, but there is an oral tradition in the ancient world that goes unacknowledged by we moderns. The laws of Moses were not compiled until the reign of Solomon, and the words of Solomon were not. This book was not compiled until the post-exilic period. The book of Proverbs was no younger than Hezekiah, as indicated by the 25th chapter. But this anonymous author clearly respects him. We hear from him briefly in verse 1, 12:2 through 1:2 through 12:8 are Solomon's words. So if Solomon was Jesus, everything in between there is underlined in red. But the author does add his own useful input in the final 6 verses of the 12th chapter. But the word quoleth translates as teacher or preacher, and so church and state are combined in one. This is an unusual combination, king and preacher, yet both David and Solomon were in the practice of addressing tribal territories, and Solomon foreign dignitaries, so it is not implausible to imagine that Solomon said this at one such an occasion. And the son of David could mean any son of David, but as verse 12 indicates in verse 16, hold those thoughts when we'll get there. The case for Solomonic authorship becomes even more clear-cut. Futility, says Quoleth. Futility, all is futile. This is the first 5, but by no means the last. There are 35 repeat occasions of this word, futility, from the Hebrew original Hebal. The Latin Vulgate translates it as vanitas, but Hebal is vist or maper, but on the 78 occasions that it appears in the Old Testament, only thrice is it physical or literal. So this word is used to describe that which is insubstantial, without substance, without meaning, without purpose. And in this word is encapsulated Solomon's, because this is him speaking, Quoleth. Solomon is never named, as he is in Song of Solomon and Proverbs, but he is, we'll make the case. But for now, this defines especially the first 2 chapters. He proceeds to have the futility of wisdom. He was a wise man with all the wisdom at his disposal. Then in the 2nd chapter, he exposes the futility of pleasure and wisdom once more in the context of weighing the relative merits of wisdom and folly. And then finally, the vanity or futility of labor. And this launches into the 3rd verse, incidentally. What does man gain from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? For what profit or what purpose do we even labor or work for anything at all? Because nothing lasts, there is nothing new in motion. So the vantage point that he adopts, he has the mind of a scientist. Now, the who, what, when, where, and the why is answered in the 2nd verse. So why he is conducting as a scientist, he has an experimental ethos. He is prepared to even explore the meaning of life in wisdom's antithesis by the 2nd chapter. But for now, he's commented, what purpose, he was certainly a man of achievement, man of accomplishment, a prestigious polymath, a wealthy king, wealthy beyond measure, wise beyond reckoning. And yet the meaning or purpose of all of this escapes him and eludes him. A generation passes away, and a generation comes, but the earth stands forever. Life on earth goes in cycles. It comes and goes. We are born and die. Ecclesiastes 3:2, a time to be born and a time to die. But within the cycles of change, the earth stands forever. It is something permanent. Now, that is not entirely true. The word of God, Isaiah 48, alone will endure, but the earth and everything on it will not. But he is approaching this from the eyes of sight rather than that of faith. So he adopts much of a secular mindset, but part of wisdom is considering all outlooks and options. Really get, you have nothing to lose by exploring the merits of even the most unlikely. That's part of the experimental ethos. You have to do the radical and the extreme sometimes, but he's looking at this through the eyes of sight and the secularists, and there's much confusion, as much as there is in the Psalms. Some of the Psalms are doubtful and just complaining, and you question what are these statements of despair and doubt doing in the Bible, and much of that we also read in Ecclesiastes. But remember, Solomon's agenda is from a concealed premise, that of an apologist. He is here to dismantle the earthbound view. And that phrase, under the sun, that we read in the 3rd verse, appears for the first of 29 occasions. So everything that is observable on the earth, everything that is under the sun. This is the earthbound view of the secularist whose stance Solomon is adopting. The sun also rises, and the sun goes, and hurries back to the place where it goes. Sun rises in the east and sets in the west, daily cycles, and as far as the Bible indicates, the only time that it ceased was when Joshua, I think the sun shone even at night on behalf of the Israelites. But within the laws of physics, he writes it as if God is imprisoned, as if he cannot break in, he cannot intervene. But he did do that on the occasion when the occasion demanded it for Israel in the days of Joshua. But within the patterns, he notices the earth in constant flux, yet prisoned in a pattern of permanence, which makes nothing new. So the sun shining is ultimately nothing new. That's verse 9. That's getting a little far ahead of ourselves. Going to the south and turning around to the north, turning on its rounds, the wind returns. So the direction of the sun rising and setting is east to west, and that of the wind is south and north, although they did speak of an east wind in the Bible. That is when the sands of the surrounding desert literally blanketed Israel for some time. But the wind is also likened to the Ruach Kadesh in the New Testament in the born-again discourse of John 3, but he's speaking of physical or literal wind right now. The wind cannot be contained, it cannot be controlled, it cannot be predicted, and it is mysterious in origin and mysterious in progression. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea never overflows. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. So the rivers are stuck in the same cycle as the sun and the wind. It comes and it goes, but it never arrives. It is never achieves its destination. It is in constant motion, constant flux, for no apparent for no obvious or even apparent purpose. Are the cycles are the laws of physics from the mindset that Solomon is approaching them from. But says this in verse 8, all matters are wearisome, no one is able to speak of it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. He's exhausted, he is at death's door, and the thought of death, the fear of death, dominates much of the discourse. So Ecclesiastes is a discourse, and it's also a series of discourses within a discourses. And because of the preacherly connotations of the title Qoleth, many scholars are inclined to interpret this book in a sermonic lens, and the New Testament equivalent would be the book of Hebrews. But what I think is what's clear is there is a preacher, but what's not indicated is an audience. These could just be as easily be interpreted as an internal monologue, the musings of one mind. So Ecclesiastes does have narrative, and the fact that there's a plot and it eventually culminates in the end, though you'd never know that by reading only as far as we're going to read today. But there's no character interaction or anything like that. But to return to verse 8, we read the word satisfaction, and the quest for satisfaction is what he is on a pilgrim's pursuit. He is longing for satisfaction. He had all the wealth, all the wisdom, every measurable advantage. He was the unique recipient of divine grace. Biographically significant moment when he was 19 years old, recently ascended to the throne. He was visited by God in a dream, and he gave him anything he wanted, a blank check, and whatever his heart's desires, and what such a one would choose in such a situation as a revelation of this character. So Solomon was wise enough to ask for wisdom. It would be an oversimplification to suggest that he was devoid of any wisdom at all before the supernatural endowment, but so pleased was God with what he asked for, and equally pleased was with he didn't ask for, that he granted them to him. He gave him wealth and the long life, and the long life was contingent on his covenantal obedience, which eventually he departed from late in life. But satisfaction is a lost search without God, and he describes him as the source of the ills in the 13th verse. What has been is what shall be. What has been done is what shall be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new, even though the sun sets and shines its light and makes things appear new, there's really nothing new because the position of the sun and the direction of the wind and where the river is coming and going, it has already happened before. It is in a vicious, endless cycle. So from the eyes of sight, the world is monotonous, mundane, and just moving in no discernible direction to any greater purpose. There is nothing new, but the eyes of faith speaks of new things. The old life passes away, behold, all things come new, the born-again experience. And behold, I shall do a new thing, Isaiah. So there is a newness to look forward to, but we can only behold what is new through the eyes of faith. We have to discard and abandon the eyes of sight in order to lay hold of what is new. So spiritual realities in the spiritual world, there is a physical world and there is a spiritual world. There is nothing new in the physical world, but there is plenty of newness in the spirit world. But there's that phrase once again, under the sun. This is the earthbound perspective. Is there a matter of which it is said, see, this is new? It was here already long ago. History is frustrating. He transitions from that of a scientist to a historian, and his frustration is encapsulated by the same mundane nature and monotonous routine, and just these inexorable progressions. So he begins with human life on the generations, and then the perfect circle of the historian is completed from verses 4 through verses 10 and 11. And Aristotle said that there was nothing that is invented that could not be invented. We, of course, from our postmodern mindsets, know a little better and differently. There is no remembrance of former ones, nor is there any remembrance of those who are to come by those who come later on. He is on the quest for immortality, whether he knows it or not. So his great longing was to have a legacy to be preserved, some lingering memory of immortality on the earth. But he is noting that history was in its infancy. And so, the great men of former ages, where are they now? They are in the dust, and they are also in the history books. And every king wants to be remembered. That's why they build monuments and do great feats and exploits for the purpose of being remembered. But for the common person who reads this, the average citizen, our potentiality for prestige is not quite as palpable. Verse 12, Iqoleth was king under Israel in Jerusalem. This makes a clear cut for Solomonic authorship, because after the reign of Solomon, the throne of Jerusalem belonged to the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel now was in the north, and the original capital was Shechem, and eventually became Samaria by the reign of Omri the first. But as the result of Solomon's departure and deviation from his covenantal obligations, the punishment was that the kingdom would be divided, though for the sake of his father David he waited until the life of his son to do it. But henceforth there would be 20 kings of David on the throne in Jerusalem through the entire history of the Davidic dynasty, which begins in 1010 BC and lasts until 586 BC. So from David to Zedekiah, any one of these could have been the sons that we read about in the first verse, but the son, because that could mean a descendant or one who mimics after someone else. Your father is the devil, John 8:44. But there is only there's only two kings from the Davidic dynasty who ruled from, and he eventually says that in verse 16 that his greatness and wisdom was more excellent than any king that had ruled in Jerusalem before him. We'll get there when we get there. And I applied my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that has been done under the sun. heavens. This evil task Elohim has given to the sons of man, to be humbled by it. Solomon has the mind of a student and a scholar and a scientist, and he is diligent in his methods that he employs in his experiments. He's searching, so he's on a quest. He's in pursuit of something, that eludes him, which is satisfaction, the meaning of life. And wisdom is incompetent to provide the answer that he seeks. This is the summation of the second part of the first chapter of Ecclesiastes, which really begins in, the transition is verse 12, but it really begins in verse 13, though. But we also read under the heavens, so under the sun, under the heavens is a slightly more less earthbound perspective. And then there is the mention of God, Elohim, and he is presented as the source of our problems rather than the solution. So he has appointed us in order to humble us, to remind us that we are not him. So there is much in the universe that we cannot comprehend, far less control, and our imperfections exist because it is the will of God. This is his, but he describes it as a malignant sickness, an evil task. But this is the gift of God given. It is given to us. And in the second chapter, he takes a more optimistic prognosis as God, accepting the gifts of God. He wants us to enjoy what we have worked for. There is the meaning of our toil, although this provides no eternal or lasting or permanent satisfaction. But while we're here, we have to give thanks to God for giving us the life that we have and remain humble. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and see all was futile, and feeding on wind. Feeding on wind, we read of the wind in the 6th verse, but this phrase appears, it is connected to the theme of futility or vanity or meaninglessness, however you translate the word hay-ball. But the feeding on wind, it's like a dog chasing its tail, feeding on wind. Wind has no weight, no substance, no nutrients. So it is vain, everything, all the works on the sun, that 3-letter word, all. So the element of universality is entailed in that simple 3-letter word. Everything that moves under the sun, everything in motion, it's just all vanity. There is nothing meaningful or purposeful on the earth, under the sun, under the heavens. Under the sun appears for perhaps at least the third times of the 29. We're on that one. The crooked could not be straightened, and what is lacking could not be counted. Crooked can be interpreted physically or spiritually. Crooked, the path that is crooked, you can pave it, but what he's really talking about is that which is wrong with the world cannot be right. There is no solution to the injustices, the infirmities, the iniquities of the earth. There is no hope, no solution, nothing remains missing. I mean, once things are missing, they are permanently so. So this adds to the futility and frustration of nothing to live for, nothing to look forward to. He is writing as if there is no resurrection, and the purpose-driven life is devoid from the king who had everything, including the wisdom to launch this quest. So I spoke to my heart, saying, see, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. And my heart has seen much wisdom and knowledge. All who were before him in Jerusalem. Now David elevated the capital city that was occupied by Jebusites prior to his conquest and conversion of the city into the capital of Jerusalem. He was not the first king of Jerusalem. One of them is listed in the 10th chapter of Joshua, and also Melchizedek from Genesis 14, the priestly figure who Abraham paid tithes to. But his wisdom and greatness was without precedent, without parallel, without rival, without equal. His wisdom, he is not lying, he is telling the truth, hence he is not bragging. This is no idle boast. He really was the greatest in measure of wealth, prestige, just power, and his reign really did constitute a golden age, but he also was able to acquire all the wealth and the prestige through his God-given wisdom and knowledge. In the relationship between wisdom and knowledge, wisdom exists above knowledge. There is a tripartite level of understanding that culminates in wisdom at the top. knowledge is the foundational one. It is the ability to know the facts. In between knowledge and wisdom is understanding. This is the ability to connect the facts, the underlying principles and connections, understanding. And then wisdom is at the top of the pyramid. Wisdom, if knowledge is the ability to take the puzzle apart, to dissect things, then wisdom is the big picture, the panoramic view that ties it all together. It transcends mere knowledge and understanding, but wisdom is also added ingredients, discretion, discernment, prudence, traits of which we read in the book of Proverbs. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I know that this too is feeding on wind. There's that phrase again, applied my heart. We read that in the 13th verse. He is a diligent, serious student, scholar, and scientist, and he has the resources to spare no expense on such an adventure, such a quest, such a pursuit. But he does it. He does not forsake wisdom, even as he indulges in the antitheses of wisdom in the second chapter. So when we get there, he is not resorting to hedonism, wine, and laughter as a means of escape, but as a means of discovery, because wisdom ultimately, the dividends of wisdom ultimately leaves him bankrupt, because wisdom itself cannot know the answer. Wisdom apart from God cannot know life's greatest questions or answer them. But madness is the state of mind, and folly is wisdom's antithesis. Madness is a deranged state of mind. Folly is slightly more benign, but they are closely connected, and neither of these are flattering traits. But Solomon does categorically consider whether folly has something to offer in the second chapter, as we've already made mention. But once more, whether they are reduced in the second chapter. We read that both cannot prevent death. So even though wisdom does enable and enhance the quality of life by giving us the resources and equipment to navigate skillfully through it, it cannot prevent the day of the death, which is the thought that dominates Solomon, the fear thereof. It's all feeding on wind, it's all vanity, it's all futile, it's all purposeless, it's all for naught, it's all for nothing, it's all for show, and there is no gain in it. Whether wisdom or folly, no exalted state of mind or even degraded or debased state of mind can provide him what he is looking for, and he conducts this with the seriousness of the scientist, the scholar, and the student. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases suffering. If ignorance is bliss, then wisdom does come with grief, and the reason that it does is because the wiser you become, the more obvious and apparent evil is and imperfections are. So this has the effect of producing dread and grief and despair and pain, and increasing knowledge. The more you know, the more you suffer. So this is our cross to bear, and this is the price of pay. This is what wisdom demands. It does not, there are positive side benefits. We are able to navigate ourselves skillfully through life, but there are also depressing, discouraging, and despairing dilemmas which it introduces, which would not be there in the absence of wisdom. So there is some truth in the saying, where ignorance is bliss, but the motto and mantra of fools is, where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. But we don't have the luxury, neither did Solomon as the king, neither do we as Christians. We have a church to build and a temple to build, and Solomon was a builder in temples, which was the ultimate manifestation of his wisdom. And this in the second chapter, after he experiments through the sources of pleasure and hedonism, rejoicing, laughter, and wine, he goes to more constructive pursuits, the works that made him great. He was a fantastic builder, a prolific one, but we already did that lesson, and that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.